Before 1941, amphibious landings were slaughter. Troops clambered over the sides of boats under machine gun fire, dropping into the surf one by one. Easy targets. There had to be a better way. Then, a Louisiana boat designer named Andrew Higgins saw a photograph, a Japanese landing craft with a ramp in the bow. He grabbed a saw, cut a hole in one of his swamp boats, and showed it at the Navy. They liked the concept, but a working prototype in time for the European invasion, it couldn't be done. Higgins told them, quote, "The hell it can't. Just be here in 3 days." The story of the Higgins boat begins far from any battlefield, in the steamy bayous of Louisiana during the late 1920s. There, a young boat builder named Andrew Jackson Higgins ran a small shipyard in New Orleans and set out to solve a swampy problem. Local trappers, loggers, and oil drillers needed a boat that could skate over shallow, obstruction-filled waters without tearing off its propeller on submerged stumps or muddy riverbanks. Higgins' answer was ingenious. In 1926, he designed a rugged wooden craft called the Eureka boat, featuring a pioneering tunnel stern that tucked the propeller into a recessed tunnel in the hull. This allowed the boat's propeller to churn in shallow water, protected from snagging debris, and in tandem with a broad, flat, spoonbill bow, it could glide over logs and up into banks with ease. Higgins' bayou boat could literally slide over floating logs and back off a muddy shore without damage, a far cry from the deep keel boats the U.S. Navy was used to. Higgins' swamp craft quickly earned a reputation for being fast, tough, and versatile. By the 1930s, he improved the design to reach speeds of over 20 knots and even turn in its own length. The bootleggers of Prohibition took note. Higgins' speedy, shallow draft boats were prized by rum runners. Ironically, the U.S. Coast Guard also bought Higgins' boats to chase those same rum runners, a testament to the craft's performance. But the Eureka's ultimate destiny lay beyond bayous and bootleggers. In 1934, Higgins drove to the Marine Corps base at Quantico with his boat in tow, determined to pitch it to the military as a potential landing craft. At the time, U.S. Marines were struggling to develop an effective small boat for amphibious landings. Existing Navy boats either couldn't handle surf or made troops clamber over high gunwales to disembark. Higgins boldly demonstrated how his nimble Eureka could run up onto a beach and retract itself, impressing a few forward-thinking Marine officers. Winning over the top Navy brass proved slower. In 1936, the Navy held trials of various small craft to find the ideal landing boat. Higgins declined to formally bid at first. He was an outsider who chafed at Navy bureaucracy, so the initial test proceeded without his craft. None of the other boats were satisfactory. They either broached in surf or forced Marines to drop 10 feet over the side when breached. Higgins realized this was his chance. His craft would succeed where others failed. By 1937, he agreed to build a Eureka test boat at a loss if he had to, and delivered a 36-foot prototype to the Navy in just 30 days, a stunningly fast turnaround. When Marines put the Eureka through its paces in early 1939, they were ecstatic. Noting that not once did it get stuck or struggle to retract off the sand, the commander of one Marine battalion reported, quote, "The Higgins boat gave the best performance under all conditions. It has more speed, more maneuverability, and lands troops higher on the beach." For Marines long accustomed to clumsy boats, Higgins' creation must have felt like a gift from the gods of war. By 1940, the Navy finally agreed to adopt Higgins' 36-foot landing boat as a standard. The Marines at last had the craft they'd been dreaming of. Still, few suspected this bayou-born design would soon storm the beaches of two oceans. Andrew Higgins, the feisty, hard-drinking Nebraskan turned New Orleanian, had effectively given the U.S. military a way to land on any shoreline. In the process, he laid the keel for victories to come. One officer would later remark, quote, "He was just about the only war contractor who delivered what he promised when he promised." The DNA of the ultimate Allied landing craft was set. All it was missing was one last critical feature, one born of combat necessity on the eve of World War II. By 1941, storm clouds of global war were gathering, and U.S. Marine planners knew they needed something more from their landing boats. Training exercises had revealed a fatal flaw even in Higgins' Eureka craft. Marines unloading had to clamber over the sides. In peacetime drills, this was merely awkward. In real combat, it was reckless, exposing men one by one to enemy fire. A grim image gnawed at planners' nerves. Troops bottlenecked at the boat's sides, getting cut down before their boots hit sand. For American engineers who peered across the ocean, the Japanese had already unveiled a solution during their invasions in China. Small landing craft with drop-down ramps in the bow that let soldiers rush out en masse. In April 1941, as American involvement in the war edged closer, a Marine Corps major showed Andrew Higgins a photograph of a Japanese ramp-bowed boat during a visit to Quantico. The sight of a bow that opened up set Higgins' mind on fire. Legend has it that Higgins immediately grabbed a saw and cut a gaping hole in the bow of one of his Eureka boats, vowing to install a ramp that could turn his workboat into a true assault craft. Navy officials argued it couldn't be done when Higgins promised a working prototype in days, not months. He answered, quote, "The hell it can't. You just be here in 3 days." Higgins rushed home to New Orleans and threw his team into overdrive. In a matter of weeks, working practically around the clock, his yard transformed a standard 36-foot Eureka hull into a new kind of attack boat. They sawed off the bow and fitted a steel ramp door, rigged with ropes and pulleys that could be dropped in seconds. On May 21, 1941, Higgins conducted a high-stakes test on Lake Pontchartrain. His modified boat roared ashore, splashing onto the beach, and dropped its bow ramp with a clang. Marines with rifles poured out the front, and a small truck trundled down the ramp onto the sand. Observers watched in amazement as the craft then backed off the beach and smoothly retracted its ramp. It was a resounding success. The new ramp boat passed with flying colors. The U.S. military had its hands on the key to amphibious assault. Higgins' Eureka design, bolstered with a steel bow ramp, was the solution they'd been waiting for, and it was promptly designated the landing craft vehicle personnel, though history would forever remember it simply as the Higgins boat. This seemingly simple addition transformed the boat's role. The Higgins boat was no longer just a ferry. It became a weapon. Fully armed troops could now charge straight off the bow in attack formation, hitting the beach running with rifles ready, instead of tumbling clumsily over the sides. Small vehicles like jeeps and howitzers could be landed directly on shore, vastly increasing the invasion's firepower. But then came Pearl Harbor, and the newly minted LCVP was about to get thrown into the fire of war, and its true value would be revealed. The Higgins boat's first test in combat came in August 1942, amid the steamy jungles and shark-infested waters of Guadalcanal. The remote South Pacific island became the stage for America's first major offensive against Japan, and a brutal testing ground for amphibious warfare. On August 7th, the morning stillness was broken by the drone of engines as a fleet of plywood and mahogany Higgins boats surged through the mist. With the cry of a landing craft away, Coast Guard and Navy coxswains gunned their throttles, driving the 36-foot vessels through the surf. For the first time, a scene which would become an icon of World War II played out. Ramps splashing down and Marines rushing onto a hostile beach. Initial resistance was light, leading one young Marine to write, quote, "The landing was almost like an exercise back at New River, except for the live ammo." However, the operation quickly turned desperate. Just 48 hours later, the disaster at the Battle of Savo Island forced American transport ships to withdraw, leaving the Marines stranded without heavy support. In this crisis, the Higgins boats transformed into the Cactus Navy, the only lifeline standing between the Marines and starvation. Operating under cover of darkness to avoid enemy aircraft, brave crews shuttled ammunition, food, and medicine from offshore caches to tiny jungle coves that larger ships could not reach. Loaded to the gunwales, these boats sustained the campaign, effectively creating a navy within a navy. They even took the offensive, mounting extra machine guns to engage Japanese supply barges in wild night firefights, proving that the humble landing craft could punch far above its weight. The campaign also produced a defining act of heroism involving the boat. In September, during a fierce counterattack at Point Cruz, a battalion of Marines became trapped and engaged in a fighting retreat. A group of Higgins boats led by 22-year-old Coast Guard signalman Douglas Monroe. With enemy fire raking the water, Monroe coolly positioned his boat to shield the evacuating troops, allowing them to scramble aboard other craft. Only when the last man was safe did he turn to withdraw, but he was struck by enemy fire. Mortally wounded, Monroe had just enough strength to ask, quote, "Did they get off?" Those were his final words. Monroe fell, ensuring 500 fellow Marines lived, earning the Medal of Honor, the only Coast Guardsman in history to receive the distinction. His sacrifice added to the already building legend of the landing craft. By February 1943, the Japanese withdrew in defeat, unable to break the supply lines the boats maintained. As one officer later summarized, quote, "Guadalcanal was saved by the coast watchers on the hills and the Higgins boats on the waves." In the early morning gloom of June 6, 1944, the Higgins boat faced its most daunting and iconic mission, the invasion of Normandy. As the gray pre-dawn light broke over the English Channel, the water was alive with a massive armada of nearly 7,000 Allied ships. Amidst this fleet bobbed an astonishing 1,500 Higgins boats, a swarm of plywood vessels preparing to spearhead the greatest amphibious assault in history. For the young American GIs huddled shoulder to shoulder inside these 36-foot craft, the experience was visceral and terrifying. Many were violently seasick from the rough channel crossing, their feet sloshing in cold vomit as the flat-bottomed boat slammed hard against the waves. Salt spray mixed with the thick diesel smoke of the engines, creating a nauseating atmosphere as officers barked last-minute orders to check gear and fix bayonets. The tension was palpable as men stole anxious glances at the ramp in front of them. That thin steel door was the only thing separating them from Hitler's Atlantic Wall. The dread was articulated by one soldier who recalled looking out at the horizon, quote, "I looked out into what looked like a solid wall of tracer bullets ahead. I said to myself, you're in as much trouble now as you're ever going to be." At H hour, 6:30 a.m., the first wave of boats roared toward the beaches, codenamed Omaha and Utah. Navy coxswains gunned their gray marine diesel engines, attempting to maneuver over sandbars and through crushing surf, while German artillery shells blew geysers of water into the air around them. Many craft took direct hits and disintegrated, while others were ripped apart by underwater obstacles. When the survivors reached the shallows of Omaha Beach, the true nightmare began. As the coxswains cried, "Ramp down," the soldiers were immediately exposed to withering fire. Veteran Sergeant Lee Pavlik vividly described the chaos, quote, "We were hit immediately by machine gun and rifle fire. I yelled to get ready to swim and fight. My 3 squad leaders in front went down." Finding the water at the bow only ankle deep, Pavlik jumped out, only to plunge up to his hips in a hidden sandbar trough. Around him, men leapt over the gunwales to escape the murderous fire pouring through the open ramp, bullets pinging off the steel and thudding into flesh. When Pavlik finally reached the cover of a beach obstacle, he took a grim head count, quote, "Only 11 of us left, out of the 30 on the craft." While Omaha was a bloodbath, the landings at Utah Beach went smoothly, partly due to a navigational error that drifted the boats into a weaker section of defenses. There, the Higgins boat successfully disgorged wave after wave of infantry, along with jeeps and anti-tank guns that splashed out of the ramps to support the advance. Throughout the day, the boats acted as a critical lifeline, evacuating the wounded and ferrying reinforcements. Navy coxswain Robert Slaughter described the relentless cycle, steering his boat with blood pooling in the well deck, quote, "We made trip after trip. The destroyers couldn't beach. The Higgins boats had to do it all." By nightfall, the Allies held the beachheads, but the cost was staggering. Nearly 1 in 3 Higgins boats was wrecked. Just over 2 months after the chaos of D-Day, on August 15, 1944, the Higgins boat spearheaded Operation Dragoon, the invasion of southern France. In the pre-dawn darkness of a Mediterranean summer, a massive flotilla converged on the French Riviera between Toulon and Cannes. This operation was designed as a giant pincer movement. If Normandy was the Allied left hook pummeling northern France, Dragoon would be the right uppercut from the south. Success depended entirely on speed and overwhelming force, made possible by thousands of landing craft, many of which had been transported all the way from the English Channel for this specific purpose. Now, they lay off the shores of Provence, bobbing in the gentle swells as they awaited H hour. When the signal came, Higgins boats swarmed the coast by the hundreds, delivering American and Free French units of the U.S. 7th Army. Unlike the high drama and bloodshed of Omaha Beach, these landings were comparatively smooth. The Germans in the south were second-rate units, caught in total surprise. Allied troops raced up the beaches against little resistance. The atmosphere was so distinct from Normandy that one U.S. Army officer described it as, quote, "a champagne campaign," noting the proximity to famous vineyards and the fact that some troops actually found time to sample local wine during the advance. U.S. paratrooper Sergeant Jesse Adams captured the surreal nature of the landing in his diary, quote, "If it weren't for the gunfire inland, you'd think we were on holiday." However, the ease of the initial landing belied a massive logistical triumph. Applying the hard-won lessons of D-Day, specifically the need to get as many landing craft ashore as quickly as possible, the Higgins boats shuttled men and material at a breakneck pace. The results were staggering. In a single day, the Allies landed over 94,000 troops and 11,000 vehicles on French soil, an influx even greater than the first day of Normandy. This overwhelming buildup caused German defenses to collapse with dizzying speed. By nightfall, Allied spearheads were nearly 20 miles inland, and the German Army Group G, which had held the region for years, began to unravel. While the holiday illusion faded as sharp battles erupted for the ports of Toulon and Marseille, the Higgins boats ensured those urban fights were supported by a steady stream of supplies. Within weeks, the ports were operational, and the German forces were caught in a headlong retreat. As the official U.S. Army report later concluded, quote, "The invasion of southern France, landing 94,000 men and 11,000 vehicles in a single day, demonstrated once and for all the strategic mobility that amphibious power conferred." Andrew Higgins' invention had rendered fixed defenses obsolete. The Allies could now throw an army ashore anywhere there was a sliver of beach. With France falling, the war would call upon the Higgins boat again, this time in the Pacific. While triumph rippled across France in mid-1944, the war in the Pacific reached a crescendo of its own. The United States had adopted a relentless island-hopping strategy, leaping across the ocean toward Japan. By October, General Douglas MacArthur was poised to fulfill his famous pledge, "I shall return," by liberating the Philippines. The target was Leyte Island, a sprawling operation involving hundreds of ships and hundreds of thousands of troops. Central to this massive endeavor were the Higgins boats. By 1944, U.S. forces utilized an expanded toolkit of amphibious craft, including tracked Amtraks capable of crawling over coral reefs that stopped standard boats. However, on the beaches of Leyte, where coral was less of an obstacle, the trusty LCVPs were available in massive numbers to deliver the bulk of the assault force. On the morning of October 20th, 1944, an armada of American transports and warships ringed Leyte Gulf. Inside the well decks of hundreds of Higgins boats, soldiers of the U.S. Sixth Army, including many Filipinos eager to free their homeland, waited nervously. As battleships pounded the shoreline, the boats swarmed forth in waves toward the beaches near Tacloban and Dulag. Despite Japanese mortar shells splashing among the craft, nothing could halt the momentum. Scores of LCVPs struck the sand, dropping their ramps to pour out battalions of troops. In an extraordinary moment of liberation, Filipino civilians risked enemy fire to rush into the surf and guide the boats to the best landing spots. In a symbolic capstone to the invasion, General MacArthur himself came ashore from a Higgins boat, accompanied by Philippine President-in-exile Sergio Osmeña. Clad in his trademark khakis and corncob pipe, MacArthur insisted on landing with the first waves. When his boat hit a sandbar and could fully beach, he dropped the ramp in knee-deep water. In full view of the cameras, the tall general and the Filipino leader waded through the surf, flanked by rifle-bearing escorts. It became one of the most electrifying images of the war. A radio jeep rolled onto the sand, and MacArthur seized the microphone to broadcast, quote, "People of the Philippines, I have returned. By the grace of Almighty God, our forces stand again on Philippine soil." Cheers erupted from civilians and soldiers alike. The landing triggered the gigantic Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle of World War II, which effectively shattered the Japanese Navy. With Japan's ability to supply its island garrisons destroyed, the Higgins boats continued their work, hopping from beach to beach to liberate Mindoro and Luzon in early 1945. They often worked in tandem with Amtraks, carrying follow-on waves and heavy equipment. To the downtrodden peoples of occupied Asia, these boats carried more than just soldiers. They carried the promise of freedom. A Filipino guerrilla on Luzon described the sight of American landing craft rushing ashore as, quote, "seeing Armageddon on the side of angels." By mid-1945, the Philippines were back in Allied hands, thanks in large part to the tireless boats from New Orleans. Now, as the Allies closed in on the Axis powers from all sides, the Higgins boat had one final grand role to play in Europe, cracking the heart of Nazi Germany itself. By March 1945, Allied armies in Europe had pushed the Germans back to their final natural defense line, the Rhine River. This wide, swift-flowing river guarded the heart of Germany, the Ruhr industrial region, and nearly every bridge over it had been blown to rubble by retreating German troops. For the Allies, it was the last major obstacle. If they could cross the Rhine in force, they could encircle the remaining German armies and drive straight into the fatherland. Once again, amphibious ingenuity came to the forefront, and the Higgins boats were about to prove their worth one last time on an entirely new stage, the rivers of Europe. General Eisenhower decreed that the Rhine would be crossed by surprise in multiple places to overwhelm the defense. That meant amphibious landings across a river hundreds of yards wide under potential fire. The British and Canadians in the north prepared Operation Plunder, a grand assault crossing with amphibious vehicles, while the Americans further south also sought to force their way over the Rhine. But first, they needed landing craft on the spot, and Germany is not exactly adjacent to the sea. The U.S. Navy pulled off a logistical miracle, hauling scores of LCVPs and other craft overland from French ports to the Rhine's west bank. In the late winter of 1945, astonished French villagers watched as enormous U.S. Army trucks trundled eastward, carrying 36-foot Higgins boats on their trailers. These convoys had come all the way from the English Channel, through recently liberated territory, headed for the front. It was an amphibious invasion by highway. By mid-March, a fleet of American landing craft was assembled near Remagen, Oppenheim, and other crossing sites along the Rhine. Under cover of darkness and massive artillery barrages, U.S. engineers and Navy Coast Guard crews slid the Higgins boats into the cold Rhine waters. One war correspondent marveled at the sight, quote, "I'd seen these same boats on the sands of Normandy. Now here they were, afloat on a German river, ready to conquer it, as they had the English Channel." On the night of March 22nd and 23rd, 1945, elements of General George Patton's U.S. Third Army launched a surprise assault crossing south of Mainz. As shells screamed overhead, American infantrymen clambered into Higgins boats on the west bank. Engine throttles opened up, and the flat-bottomed craft shot across the dark, swirling Rhine. Packed in shoulder to shoulder, the GIs could scarcely believe they were undertaking a D-Day-style landing in the heart of Germany. One lieutenant said, quote, "We felt invincible in those Higgins boats. We'd come all the way from Omaha Beach to the Rhine in them." The crossings met sporadic resistance. Some German units fired flares and machine guns, but many were too disorganized or shocked to mount a defense. The Higgins boats plowed through floating debris and strong currents, landed on the eastern bank, and dropped their ramps to unload men directly into the heart of Germany. By dawn, multiple beachheads were secure. One dramatic photo shows British Prime Minister Winston Churchill himself stepping off a Higgins boat onto the German shore on March 25th, cigar clenched in teeth, a moment of pure symbolism that the Allies could go anywhere, even across the Rhine. The Rhine crossings were the final proof of the landing craft's strategic value. They allowed the Allies to surmount the last major geographical barrier holding back their armies. Once over the Rhine, Allied forces fanned out into Germany's heartland. In April 1945, American and British armies encircled the Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heart, trapping hundreds of thousands of German troops and choking off the Third Reich's war production. The collapse of German resistance in the West accelerated rapidly. After the crossing, Eisenhower declared, quote, "The road to victory is open." Indeed, victory in Europe came just weeks later, on May 8, 1945. It's no exaggeration to say that the Higgins boats helped carry the Allies to final victory, quite literally ferrying Allied firepower across that last obstacle. Over the course of the war, these craft had landed in North Africa, Italy, Normandy, southern France, across innumerable Pacific islands, and even on the banks of the Rhine. The boat that started in the Louisiana bayou had not only crossed the English Channel, it had crossed the Rhine into the heart of Germany. The final chapter of World War II in Europe was written with Allied tanks and troops pouring through breaches made possible by those plywood workhorses. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the Allies stood triumphant, recognizing the humble Higgins boat as one of the war's unsung heroes. This landing craft provided the tactical flexibility to hit the enemy where he least expected, from tiny Pacific atolls to the fortified European coast. Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower paid the ultimate tribute to its creator, Andrew Higgins, stating bluntly, quote, "Higgins is the man who won the war for us. If Higgins had not designed and built those LCVPs, we never could have landed over an open beach. the whole strategy of the war would have been different. British Prime Minister Churchill seconded this, viewing these craft as the key to defeating Hitler's Fortress Europe. By the war's end, Higgins Industries had achieved an industrial miracle, building over 23,000 boats. Starting with a handful of workers, the company exploded to employ over 20,000 people by 1943. Notably, this was an integrated workforce, including women and African Americans, a rarity in the segregated South. They churned out landing craft at record speeds, sometimes completing an entire LCVP in mere days. The sheer volume of production astonished the Axis powers. Japan's foreign minister despaired at the endless swarms of boats during the Normandy landings, while Adolf Hitler spitefully dubbed Higgins the new Noah for building an ark's worth of vessels to deliver armies onto enemy shores. In the Pacific, the verdict was equally strong. Marine Corps General Holland Smith declared that the LCVP, quote, did more to win the war in the Pacific than any other single piece of equipment. These boats became the backbone of amphibious task forces at bloody battles like Tarawa, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. By 1944, a staggering 92% of all U.S. Navy vessels were small landing craft. They were everywhere. The defining image of the war became soldiers spilling out of a ramp and into the surf.